Not demanding.
All right. We're recording.
Thank you, Julian. Good morning, everyone. I would like to begin and call to order the meeting of the Municipal Accountability Review Board for the subcommittee of the MARB for the city of Hartford. And the time is 10:14. We do have a quorum. That's the reason for the little bit of a delay this morning. And I do not have any opening remarks this morning. Ms. Shaw.
Good morning, all. No opening remarks.
Thank you. Then let's move on to the approval of the minutes from October the 20th that are included in your packet. Any questions? If not, I'm looking for a motion for approval of the minutes. Thank you, Bob. Can I get a second, please?
Second.
Christine, I'll take your second. Any discussion? I hear none. All in favor, please. Aye.
Aye.
Christine, I didn't hear yours.
Because I don't, I'm going to abstain.
Oh,
I was
thank
waiting
you.
for you to ask for abstentions.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry. And Mr. White, I'm sorry, Mr. Waxenberg, I did not hear you.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Very good. All right.
Mark, you have to speak up.
The minutes have been approved. Thank you. The next item on the agenda is to review and discuss and take possible action on a labor contract from the Board of Education, their building and grounds supervisors, and that's Local 818. Earlier this week, the Hartford Board of Education approved a successor contract for the Building and Ground Supervisors bargaining unit, and the contract had expired in June of this year. A new contract has terms of July 1st, 22, so this will be a retro, through June 30th of 2026. And this small group covers about 7 employees. The MARB has the authority to approve, reject, or take no action on this contract. And if the board chooses to take action, we have until December the 15th to do so. And the business office has provided us, the Board of Ed business office has provided us with an analysis and a markup of the contract. I'm going to ask the staff, probably Chief Penn, I'm going to turn that over to you to provide an overview to the subcommittee.
Good morning again, everybody. Thank you. Yes, this is a very small bargaining unit for us. I think there's actually more voting members of the MARB than there are members of this unit, as there's just 7. And these are our 3 head custodians at the largest high schools that we have, and the 4 custodial supervisors that we have that make up this bargaining unit. As you said, this is now the 8th contract we've brought before you. We've got 3 more in the works and 1 that expires at the end of this year. So we're getting very close to getting fully caught up on renegotiating all our labor contracts at this point. As you can see, yeah, no, it's good progress that we made. I'm happy with that too. General wage increase of 2.5% across the board for each of the 4 years. And I would say literally the only thing that changed in this contract was wages, the percentage contribution toward insurance premium, and that they get to keep their vacation days if they transfer into this union from somewhere else. And that's it. This was a very, very short negotiation with these folks. The one thing that's kind of different is they had pointed out to us during the negotiation process that there is a range of salaries that exist for each of these positions. And when you look at it, the way this was structured is if you come in at the bottom of the range, other than general wage increase, you don't move off the bottom of the range, which is different than most of our contracts that have steps or that have range adjustments. And the parallel that I would bring up that you've seen before is our administrator's contract, where if an administrator is not on top step, they get a 27% of the difference between the low and high of the range until they get to the max of the range. So in the administrator's contract, it takes basically 4 years to move from the bottom of the range to the top of the range. In this one, the way we set it up was a 10% differential. So 10%, that implies that to go from the bottom of the range to the top of the range would take you 10 years over the course of that, right? And it was an acknowledgement of the fact that there was some logic to, listen, we're not rewarding you for your past experience, right? So we built in this new mechanism going forward. Long story short, the total increase over the 4 years is $68,000. This is a fairly small bargaining unit, like I said. We've already built in a 2% increase into the 22-23 budget, so the impact on 22-23 is under $2,000. They did agree to a 0.5 percentage point increase in their contribution toward insurance premiums over the duration of the contract. That amounts to something like an $8,000 savings because, again, this is just a small bargaining unit, but it is an offset to the overall cost. And so this was one of the easier negotiations I've said that we've gone through so far. And then we'll process the retro once it's fully approved by the MARB in the full meeting at the beginning of December, I guess it would be. And I'm happy to take any questions.
I was surprised to see that the vacation didn't, if they were already an employee, that the vacation didn't carry forward with them. And
Yeah.
that was, you think that was just a miss?
Yes. Yeah, we do
Yeah.
think it was a miss. And so we're fixing that. And there's not a lot of turnover in this unit, so it's not like something that would have been a recent impact. But it's something that we'll address in case there is there are people in this unit that will be retirement eligible, so we know there will be some turnover in the future. And I think it's just being preparatory for when that happens.
Questions?
Yes, two quick questions. I think this is fine, but one is there a reason they are not migrating to the partnership plan?
Yes, we don't have any of our bargaining units on the partnership plan. These folks are already on the high deductible health plan.
Okay.
And they've been there for some time. There's a follow-up to that, but I'll take your second question first.
The other one, I did notice in the contract that there was a page labeled confidential. I'm not asking to pry, but what is the subject matter of?
It was only labeled confidential because it hadn't been approved by our board yet.
Okay.
So I had sent Julian the materials in advance of that, I guess I take that back. I sent Julian the materials at some point, didn't take the white mark off the watermark off the page. But it was really confidential because it had to be discussed in an executive session. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And then Mr. White, the follow up to that is, I think I may have signaled this at one of the full meetings. We're in the middle of an RFP right now for our healthcare services. Matter of fact, I think the responses to the RFP are due back by the end of tomorrow, as a matter of fact, and we're using Siegel as our consultant for that. And as part of that process, we'll be looking at, again, what the state partnership plan could potentially offer versus what the cost differentials are based on what's proposed to us. And actually, I've had conversations with our contact at Siegel about inviting all the unions into the RFP review process because the unions have, depending on the contract, anywhere from a 30 to 60-day look at potential change in carrier. And so the easiest way to accomplish that and still be on the timeline that if we were to invoke a change is to have them be there at the table as we're looking at all these different things. And that email will be going out shortly to all the union heads with an estimated timelines of like how much work is involved in doing this and when we think the bulk of the work is going to take place.
Sounds good.
Great. Mark, I see your hand is up. And
yeah, a couple quick comments. Obviously, this has already been approved by the board, so I have no problem with this. The only thing I would say is the automatic. What tends to happen now is that these insurance premium cost shares have a tendency to automatically increase by 0.5%, 1%, et cetera. The goal being whatever 25%. My concern in the future is that the management, obviously being an advocate, consider the wages of the individuals when doing that, because having an increase in premium share along with an increase low-wage workers to me don't need to have a 25% premium share. But those are my own personal beliefs. So, and I'm not going to object to anything that's in here, other than to ask that when you do negotiate with whatever groups are less, consider the salaries commensurate with premium share as a package to say what would be quote unquote more fair based on the salaries that they're receiving.
I don't disagree with you, Mr. Waxenberg, and I think if you look back at the 8 contracts we've negotiated recently, I think you'd find that the lowest wage workers actually do reflect that. These are fairly high wage earners relative to some of the non-certified positions that we have in the district. And I think if you were to look at some of the lowest ones, they'd be at about a 14 or a 15% premium share, and these ones are at 22, which is more indicative of where we are with some of the higher wage earners.
Right, and obviously they have opportunities for other, for overtime and things of that nature, I guess. But
Right.
And the only other thing is on the partnership. I'm hearing rumblings out of the comptroller's office, just for your, and I don't know if you've heard the same thing, that there is no funds available from the state for a reserve for claims, and also the INR, the costs for coming out of a system. So, and my understanding is, or the IBNR, the difficulty we had with West Haven paying their bills, and my understanding is it's close to $80 million that the partnership plan could find itself in arrears, or the necessary funding, or the only other way is to increase the premiums to the policyholders. And I also have heard through my various sources that there is a migration from the partnership back to high deductibles based on those concerns. And you've probably heard the same. So,
Actually, I'll be blunt, Mr. Waxman. That's the first I've heard of it, but I appreciate the intel because that's. I think you're right. If they've got an $80 million hole, the only way they're going to be able to cover that is by increasing their current premiums.
That's correct, and or the legislature stepping in and funding it appropriately.
Yeah.
But that said, I would just maybe you could, in your daily activities, of which you have multiple times to do, I'm sure, contact the comptroller to do a little. And Siegel, being the state's consultant, should have that information available.
Yeah, they're pretty careful about walling off information between units, obviously, for the reason that they don't want to compromise that relationship with the state.
Right.
Right. Good point.
Yep.
So
but I appreciate the intel nonetheless, and we'll make sure to incorporate that view.
Yeah, my first question to them would be, how many have migrated away from the partnership?
Yeah.
And the second one is, do we have any potential fiscal cliffs coming that could cause premium share increases that would be disadvantageous? And I'm an advocate for the partnership, as everybody knows.
Yes.
But I'm just not sure that the state is taking the appropriate steps to fund it appropriately, which could backfire on the policyholders,
Understood.
Outside of that, I'm perfectly fine, Madam Chair, with the contract.
Can I get a motion? Unless there's any other discussion.
So moved.
Thank you, Mark. Who hit me with the second? I'm sorry.
Bob.
Thank you. Any discussion? Any other discussion? I hear none. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All right. Motion carries. You are all set, Mr. Penn. We will
Appreciate
see
that.
you.
Thank you.
We will see you at full MARB for final presentation on this contract. Julian, did I hear you trying to pipe in?
No, I thought you were dismissing Mr. Penn, but
Oh, I
know.
there's
No.
another
One more thing.
agenda
I'm good.
item. I think
Yeah.
you were
Oh,
just sort
no.
of concluding that agenda item. Sorry.
Yes. No, he cannot leave. Thank you, though. Thank you for having my back. We all need that. All right. Next agenda item is discussion of the special education article that we have disclosed, and I think that it was disclosed in our last meeting. And this was, we would like to revisit this as for special education. We started to talk about this at the beginning of, I believe, last month. And so
Right.
the Board of Ed provided us a copy a copy of what the report by the state, by the school and the state financial project discussing the issue of a revised formula and for calculating the distribution of special education excess cost reimbursements. This was provided to give us an awareness of an issue for this subcommittee to be aware of. And the business office has prepared, Chief Penn has prepared a brief memo that I'll outline 2 areas that would provide some relief to the district. So I'm going to turn it over to the chief and let him fill us in on the awareness.
Terrific. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
So just to set the context for excess cost, the excess cost grant for the city of Hartford Public Schools is worth a little over $6 million a year. So it's very meaningful for us in terms of funding what we need to cover, particularly for our highest need students, right? And that's typically where excess cost comes into play. And if you're unfamiliar with the formula, the threshold you have to cross before you receive any reimbursement from the state in excess cost is 4.5 times net current expenditures per pupil, NCEPP. And the 4.5 somehow ties to the ECS and the assumption that 22% of the ECS is related to special education. So you take 4.5 times 22%, you wind up at 99 point some odd percent, right? Now, to me, those figures don't go together, right? But I know that's how they got there. Because why would you all of a sudden assume that 4.5 times whatever your embedded special education rate is the appropriate rate, right? If you're saying constitutionally it's a free and appropriate public education, you should be indifferent around whether or not it's 4.5 times whatever that number is. Set that aside for a minute. When we then look at all the ESSER funding that we've been given, and is now embedded in our cost, that additional cost drives up our NCEPP. And when I asked my counterparts at the state level, hey, is there an exclusion in the calculation for ESSER? The answer was no. So in effect, all the additional ESSER spending is driving up our net current expenditures per pupil, making the hurdle rate that much harder, right? Okay. Legislature last year takes a look at trying to get a fix in place for how do we award this grant in a more equitable fashion. And that's terrific. And for the first time in as long as I can remember, they bumped up the appropriation from 141 million to 156 million. When you look at the formulas that are in the 3 different tiers of the award, that if the total amount requested exceeds the appropriation, what they then do is they go to an allocation methodology. Now, prior to this change in the legislation, the allocation was exactly the same for everybody. If it worked out that 80%, which is what it was last year, or 78% or 68%, whatever the number was, fit the appropriation, that's the appropriation that everybody got once they crossed the threshold. What they then said is, no, we're going to use a different model that puts more money in the hands of the needier districts. Okay, again, noble intent. However, when somebody smarter than me went and ran all the numbers from 21-22 against those percentages, they realized that the full value of the grant wouldn't have been awarded. And if you look at how the legislation reads, there's no mechanism for awarding the difference. So theoretically, good intent, but now you're not awarding the full value of the grant anymore. And so there's a few issues that come into play. From my perspective, I've always kind of been a bug for me. Why isn't 100% of the cost covered? And there was actually 2 years and something like the last 15 where they forgot to amend the legislation to change the years. And so it became 100% of the cost. But for many years since then, it's now been whatever the limit of the appropriation is. And I get it. You can't fund everything in the state. I'm not blind to that, right? However, these are our neediest kids. And if you're saying it's a constitutional right to a free and appropriate public education, why wouldn't you fully fund that? Part two of that then it becomes, how do we fix this legislation and do it quickly? Because now this is affecting our current year financials. So we're going to get 76.25% of whatever our calculated number is, which is going to be down 3.75% for what we were awarded last year. But if there's any money left over, we're not going to get awarded it because there's no mechanism in place. So the legislation's got to get changed very early in the session to either change the percentages in a way that works, or come up with some alternative on how to award any remaining money on a pro rata share by tier or something along those lines to fix this. And the reason I'm saying it's got to get done early in the session, our final submission to the state on this goes in February or March, somewhere in there, in mid-session, to find out what we're going to get paid in May. So it's kind of imperative that we get this thing changed in a way that makes sense going forward, because I don't want to be exposed on a significant drop in that grant because there can't be an allocation of what was fully intended to be. And I'll pause there before we kind of get to topic number two.
When you say that this is going to happen early on, and me not being a political gal, even when we go forward with our budget every year, biennial, it isn't until the governor actually signs off on all of that. And that is at the end of session when everything is closing. So even though you're asking for this to happen early on, if we go through the process, and there are far wiser folk on this call than myself in this arena, I would say that I still don't think that it could occur until session has closed.
I guess my pushback to that might be that these are funds that were already appropriated in the last legislative session. Mm-hmm. So it's a way of coming up with a mechanism to fix what it was already been in place. Mm-hmm. So it wouldn't change the appropriation necessarily, but at least it would give the CSDE, State Department of Education, the ability to award the full value of the grant.
Okay. Mark, I see your hand up.
There are ways to fix this through the elapsing process, through the mid-budget adjustments. There are ways, and
okay.
I'm sure, at least I'm hopeful, that your concerns, as well as others around the state, have been relayed to the chairs of the appropriate committees, mostly appropriations and finance, and you have John Fonfero, who's the head of finance from Hartford. So, you know, this has been an issue way back when I was involved with, as a policy director up there for Governor Weicker, you know, trying to move the ball or the needle on special education. It used to be 5. We tried to get it down to significantly less, and it ended up at 4.5, which was, I got Sal calling me. Yeah, Sal. Good, I'm online here on MARB. What can I call you back? Okay, bye. I didn't know if he was calling because he's on MARB or not. But so yes, the issue you raise about special education funding and cost share, excess cost share, has been one that's been around since prehistoric times, and nobody's wanted to grab the bull by the horns and come up with a methodology that's equitable. I mean, Hartford, being one of the largest school districts, obviously on a simple flat rate is going to spend a lot more money than Sprague, our other town. Yet when Hartford gets a special education student, the budgetary impact on Hartford is significantly less than one special education student in Sprague. So, you know, there's a lot of factors to be considered, but I'm glad that you are in the arena. I'm glad that I'm out of that arena, and that you'll press forward with appropriate, equitable funding in that area, because that's extremely important. It's been that way historically, so I wish you good luck.
Yeah, I appreciate that. All right. Ms. Shaw has her hand raised.
Yes.
Thank you for walking us through that, Mr. Penn. I just want to make sure I understand. You indicated that your expectation, given the flaws of the legislation, that you'll receive 76% of
That's right.
the calculated number. So the impact of this is roughly 24% less than what you would have otherwise expected off of the 6 million.
No, the roughly 24% is the piece that my district at a local level then needs to cover on that
Okay.
excess. So we've got it has an impact on us overall that if we can't find additional special education funds to cover that, we have to take money out of our general education area to pay for that difference.
And with the fix, you expect to get back up to 100%?
No,
that-
but
Okay.
at least I'd have a shot at like the full value of the grant being awarded.
Because the allocation, the pro rata allocation of the excess funds.
Yeah, exactly. The pro rata, the way it stands right now, if you ran it against the 21-22 numbers, does not fully award the grant.
So what you received in 21 was, you said 6 million?
For 21-22 is just a little over 6 million. That's right.
And if everything was constant, what would happen in this 23?
That's a little bit dependent on what my NCEPP went up to.
Okay.
And what my overall costs come in for, which we're in the process of calculating right now.
But you're anticipating a reduction of how much? Don't
I
say
am.
percent. How much?
I mean, all
A
other things
million?
being,
2 million?
If everything else was equal, I'd expect my allocation to go down by at least 3%. The difference between the 80% they awarded last year,
Yep.
and the 76.25 they awarded this year.
Okay.
And this may be outside of the scope of what of your role here, but do you have any sense of the fiscal impact associated with this change to other towns? I mean, I imagine that Hartford is not the only one contending with this. I'm just trying to get
Oh
a
no,
sense
not
of the
at all.
magnitude.
Actually,
Yeah.
I was at a CASBO meeting. CASBO is a Connecticut Association of School Business Officials meeting on Tuesday. And it was the board meeting. This was actually a fairly hot topic of discussion during our legislative discussion, that we know that there's a fix that needs to happen. So CASBO is in the process of making sure we try to get the change made. Connecticut Association of Superintendents, CAS, is also involved, public school superintendents, and you know, you're right in saying that we have access to some decent people that represent us out of Hartford that are in this process as well. But you know, I'm taking you up on your past offer that if MARB can weigh in on something, this would be a big one for us, and for a lot of other districts as well. It's meaningful well beyond Hartford.
Thank you for bringing that to our attention.
Mr. Waxenberg's got his hand up.
Oh, thank you.
Obviously, the issue, it's what I call capping. You know, you put so much money in the pot, and then when it's all gone, it's capped, because you just take the bills that are coming in, the money that you have, and you say, I only can pay for 70%. So in the old days, they'd say, okay, everybody gets 70%.
Right.
Now they come up with a formula that is obviously had unintended consequences within that cap. So the issue really for the state at times is not only the formula, the capping formula, but the funding of the excess cost sharing. You know, if it's 20 million, I don't know what the numbers are nowadays, but if, let's say, the difference between the bills coming in and the amount of money in the pot to distribute is 20 million, and historically has been 20 million, but it will always increase because of the net per pupil expenditure. Then legislatively, you have to take the bull by the horns and say, we need more money in the pot, regardless of what your formula may or may not be. You would need a formula if you had all the money in the pot to distribute above the NCECP net current expenditures per pupil. So there's two issues to me. Number one is equitable, I shouldn't say equitable, appropriate funding of the education cost share, which has only been done twice, as you've said.
Yeah.
Failing that, then you're into redistribution based on X, Y, or Z. The smaller town legislators are going to say, wait a second, I may be wealthier than Hartford, but one outplacement in my town is going to cost me 5 times as more, the budgetary impact.
Mhm.
So it's kind of, I'm not a big believer at times for sliding scales on this type of formula, but that's neither here nor there. So
Yeah.
I think that from an OPM perspective and or a legislative perspective, I would advocate for the funding, increased funding to the education cost share, because it's been woefully underfunded for years based on the capping, and they just go along their merry way rather than saying that by capping this, you've created a significant burden on cities and towns. And I could get into the impact that it's on each local district about how they don't identify because of the monetary impact of the locals, but it's always been there. And I think the first battle is the increased funding for education cost share. And if it comes close, then the capping becomes somewhat irrelevant.
Well, I think you're right, because and this comes back to Ms. Kennison's point around what can you do quickly in the session versus what's got to come out at the end of the session, right? So if you're changing the appropriation, that's something that happens at the end. And I don't disagree with you. I just did a quick back of the envelope that came up with to fully value excess cost is 176 million versus the 156 that's there now in the legislation. So I agree with you. If this was fully funded, that's about what the delta is between an appropriate formula that allocates it versus like everybody getting paid what the actual amount of the bills are. But there's this front end piece around fixing the legislation that's already there to make sure that the full amount of the grant is distributed. But yeah, I think there's a longer term issue on getting us back to 100% funding of the cost once you exceed the thresholds that are set.
I agree, and I agree that you need to address through the lapsing process or whatever the appropriation mechanism they can use to change for this year, so it limits your impact, and then dealing with the $20 million gap that exists in funding for the future. And
That's right.
obviously, 4.5 times is a pretty big lift. I mean, we've always known that it should go. Our goal was always 3 times. I always advocated for anything above the NCEP should be paid, but regardless, whatever we can advocate for, and you're better than I as to the redistribution formulas. Let us know what we can do from. I don't know what communication the secretary can have with various folks on this issue for the fix. And then, of course, OPM is intimately involved in the budget making process. So maybe there could be a little adjustment made for that in that fund to hopefully fully fund it and at least move towards that, as they try to do with ECS and never do. But at least you can say it and then try to do it.
Right.
Shall we go to part 2?
Sure.
Please.
All right. Part 2 is a little more Hartford specific, and I'll acknowledge that up front. But it's important for the context. As you know, open choice leads to a lot of our students attending schools outside of Hartford and outside of Hartford's purview. And when you look kind of across all those open choice placements, 600 of our students are currently identified as special education. And if you look further into those numbers, there's another pool of students, about 50, that are actually outplaced to other facilities by those receiving districts. There is a huge amount of work associated with what's called the PPT meetings for those students, planning and placement team. And I've included in that memo a little bit of background on what the planning and placement team is supposed to do. Put bluntly, we do not have the resources to cover all those meetings. And so in some respects, we're left blind to decisions that are being made that have a direct financial bearing on us going forward. Because regardless of where the student is attending school, we're responsible for the special education costs associated with that student. So whereas the receiving district gets open choice funds from the state for the student attending on the general education piece, the sending district, i.e. Hartford, is responsible for all the special education costs. So we really don't have a seat at the table. We have the right to have a seat at the table, but we don't have the funding mechanism or the people to be able to be there as these decisions are being made. And the way the PPTs work is any member of the PPT team could call a meeting of the PPT, right? So it's not just one a year. Usually it's a couple of them a year, times all those students. And so what we're proposing is something where we have funding for one for roughly every 50 kids that are special ed identified that are in open choice. So if you think about the 600 that we have, we're looking for funding for 12 people. And this is a little bit more complicated, right? Because like I said, Hartford's a little more unique in terms of the open choice rules and the chef settlement. But this is a big blind spot for us financially. We just don't have the physical resources or the funding to support those resources to have a member of our team from special education be at all those meetings as the decisions are getting made. And I don't want to suggest to you that having somebody on the team makes the cost go away. That's not accurate either, right? Because really you're just there for the decision making. But it gives you a better view, particularly on the 50 students that are outplaced to other facilities. Was that the correct decision? Or can those students be repatriated somewhere else and in some other manner before we're on the hook for those costs through a third-party facility, a third-party provider? And I see Mr. White's got his hand up, and I can pause
He
there
does.
if you like.
I do have one question.
Yeah.
Bob, Mr. White, go ahead. You go first, and then I will ask.
Oh, no, fine. Yeah, I remember at some point the superintendent talked to us about these meetings and the inability to cover. And the question, and she said the same thing you did, which is if we have somebody at the meeting, it's not going to drive down the cost necessarily. And it just the system, and I'm certainly not as familiar with it as Mark is, but you got people at the meeting saying what's in the best interest of the student who have no constraint of cost. And, someone from Hartford comes in and is the wet blanket and, cares about the kid. But at the same time, are there other things? And what are they going to say when, the others are saying, well, this is the best out there. The whole special ed system where it's like a blank check is I can't get my head around it. You care about the kids, but there's a lot of other kids that aren't special ed that, money's coming out of their education. So I guess the issue is that sufficient? Or should there be some broader mechanism where, and, I don't want to cast any aspersions on receiving towns, but if confronted with the choice of taking care of these special needs kids in-house in the suburbs versus sending them out to a respected facility where you don't pay for it, that's an easy decision, and I don't think it's fair to Hartford. So is there some notion that maybe we ought to take a look at where the money comes from for these private placements? That was my question.
It comes from us. That's
Well,
yeah.
No. Where should it come from?
Yeah. Mr. White, special education is a tough topic in this state, right? We're a burden of proof state where the burden's on the district to prove what the need is as opposed to the burden being on the parent. And we've talked about that before too. you know, I think a lot of the stuff as it pertains to special education is going to have to be evolutionary rather than revolutionary in this state. I mean, I think it's going to be small incremental gains that get us to a place that's at least better than where we are today, until somebody comes along that's really willing to rip the Band-Aid off and say, let's fix this the right way. Because we spend an enormous amount of time sifting through bills coming through from other districts, for instance, matching up to make sure that the kid that they're claiming that we have is really our kid, to try and identify that the resources that we're paying for actually match the IEP, the individualized education plan for that child, and making sure that we're not overpaying using Hartford's dollars for something that, you're absolutely right, receiving district doesn't have a financial interest in, other than getting those costs covered. So it's a fundamentally flawed system that we're blind to that right now as those decisions are being made. And so I guess, you know, like I said, this is a little bit unique to Hartford in terms of the open choice system. But it's one of the bigger things that concerns my executive director of special education. I think you met in a previous meeting, Jen Hoffman, that this is something that's always bothered her since coming to Hartford, is that this is how the system operates today.
Thank you.
So a question, Mr. Penn, of the 12 resources that you said that you would need in order to do this review or evaluation, are you then saying that's on the 600 kids, or is it the 600 kids that are identified as the special ed? Yes,
It's the 600. That's correct.
It's the 600.
And
So
the
with
50 and the 50 I spiked out would be inclusive in that 600. That's right.
Okay. But at this moment, because of you don't feel you have the resources even to tackle the 50?
No, not to be honest with you. So I would have to go back to my head of special ed and find out if we're attending any of those that are out of district open choice, where there is a PPT that's involved for one of the outplay students. I'll reconfirm that for you.
Okay. And I guess the second thing is if the answer is no, and you came up with the calculation that you would need 12 for the 600, is then when you calculate that, that is then saying that's the book of business each person could handle, and that's the standard book of business is what you're hearing?
She was, my head of special education had reviewed that with me.
Okay.
Recognizing that there's somewhere on average between 2 and 3 PPTs per student per year is pretty typical.
Okay. And Ms. Shaw, you had a question.
Yes, I too, like Mr. White, recall extended conversations with the Madam Superintendent on issues related to special education funding. And I recall that the discussion went beyond the idea of a proverbial blank check. That, you know, it wasn't just the fact that the city didn't have the resources to have representation at the various towns for these PPTs, but there were also concerns about the actual costs per pupil for certain services. I remember there was some analysis, speech and language pathology services, for example, where there were kind of fairly significant disparities in comparable services, but depending on what town was, you know, making the decision or recommendation. So I seem to recall that there was some preliminary analysis of the kind of per student cost of some of these comparable services. I don't know where that ended up. I know it was a very, very big project. But I'm wondering, Mr. Penn, if you have any insights into whether there is additional kind of a deeper dive on the actual expenditures beyond who's paying for them.
So from my perspective, and I don't want to speak for the superintendent on this, right? But I'll share my perspective on this, having been a Board of Education member for 11 years and in a municipal government for 7. Districts can set whatever price they want. Right. And when you look at speech and language pathology, and when you look at all the specialties underneath special education, they are tied in theory to the underlying teacher contract in that district. So what you pay that teacher in that district will very often drive what the hourly or daily rate is that's going to turn up in these services in a billing that comes into a sending district. So in some respects, you can have a whole lot of variation just on that basis, right? Because clearly towns don't pay teachers the same. We know that. Towns then will sometimes cover their overhead through that process, right? You know, it's not just the salary, it's the fringe that you offer to those employees that are embedded in there, and the overhead cost. And so it's very often to see on some of these bills varying numbers around what the overhead charge is going to be. But there really is no mechanism that controls what the pricing is going to be, other than we see something that's way out of line and we'll go back and try to negotiate it with that district. But at the end of the day, there's no set statute or no set formula around how much can you charge. How much can you charge for your overhead, for instance, right? There's no set formula around that. So yes, you've identified another big variant that we have, because we don't see the same rate from year to year. It would be atypical to see that, because changes in the teacher contract, changes in the other provider contracts will drive the increase in cost inflation, similar to what we experience here with our own contracts.
So it would, so just a quick follow-up. So it would strike me that, you know, there's a long list of challenges around this issue.
Right.
And certainly without having any expertise on special education funding, thankfully this committee has the benefit of those who have deep experience in this area. I don't know if there's ever been discussion of a formula that would make sense, comparable to other kind of funding cost sharing mechanisms. Just throwing it out there, but I do think that once the bigger, more pressing issues are resolved, this could be yet another topic for discussion as part of, you know, how it is the state approaches these funding issues.
And Michelle, if I could just piggyback off that, you know, one of the things we know there's a lot of issues with special education, right, and the way it's funded. And I try to approach this from the point of view of, like, what are the most immediate things that would benefit us, right? Knowing that there's big things that could potentially be over the horizon that we could fix, like the one you just brought up. But as I really kind of thought about what can we do now versus what can potentially happen 3 legislative sessions from now, you could say that to start laying the groundwork for some of that, and in consultation with our special ed director, what's the immediate fix that would benefit us the most? And that's kind of how we came up with these 2.
Right. Thank you.
Mr. Waxenberg's got his hand up.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that it's a measured approach, like you said, with the most important or the most dramatic. I mean, the law talks about the receiving district paying, being on the hook for reasonable and customary costs. That's in statute, but that's the argument. What's reasonable and customary compared to the Hartford students? Well, it's going to require regulation. It doesn't require statutory, but statutory can infer regulation. There is no common point of reference. Like you said, I mean, for the state to come up with a regulation that every school district on the receiving level, on an open choice, because you do have Bridgeport and some other districts that have some choice programs, and you do have some that don't want to even go near it because of the issues that we're talking about here. So dealing with the, you know, I understand the salaries, et cetera. My concern is there's nobody, and you're doing the best you can as the sending district. But my concern is, as Bob said, it's almost like a blank check that the receiving district can use to, and I hate to say this about school districts, but I'm familiar with them, that they can throw in issues that they now can reduce their own costs by. In other words, if the IEP calls for a speech and language pathologist to have a child for 2 hours a week, and all of a sudden you're getting bills for part of the person's salary versus some other mechanism that identifies 2 hours a week, that's an issue because there's no commonality. So I've always advocated that an IEP should have a cost associated with each intervening issue. That does not exist. It just says the child will get X, Y, Z services. And I agree with that because the child needs the services. But associated with those services should be an analysis of costs for the sending district to receive, to say, okay, this potentially from this IEP, based on all these services, intervening services, this is what you can expect the cost to be based on this regulation or formula that's now being used, so that everybody understands ahead of the game, and you can plan for and budget for 600 special education services and funding those needs. And that's where the whole issue, that's A. B comes in where the over-identification of special education by the receiving district. I'm just not convinced, and this is for your 50 people, I'm just not convinced that choice students are not being over-identified in the receiving districts. In other words, if a teacher has a child that's ADHD, there are ways to deal with that child outside of either outplacing them or having to do A, B, C, D, and E. But as a receiving district, it's an incentive for me to say, they're not from West Hartford, I'll do this with this district because Hartford's got to pay anyway. So it's a shift of educational
burden.
costs and educational need as well. So to me, it's not only the costs associated with it, it's the appropriate education in accordance with IDEA that could be impacted by some of these fiscal decisions. It's a much longer and broader conversation than just the Hartfords of the world, because as you said, the parent that hires Howard Klebanoff's firm gets the best benefit. He walks through the door and he gets whatever he wants. Not he personally, but in the old days, he would walk in, they'd say, whatever you want, because it's the knowledge of the law that gets the action rather than the intent of educating the child in their best interest. So it's a philosophical, fiscal, and educational issue that needs to be discussed and dealt with. But I do think there are ways, as I said, through regulation, where school systems can get your special education person to say, okay, let's put a price tag, or not a price tag, but let's, through the PPT process, start identifying the costs associated with these services. Not that you're going to say we can only spend $10, but we're going to say so that Hartford can understand that Mark Waxenberg, based on this PPT, it's going to cost them $20,000. At least you know that. That's A. And B, you need somebody at the table to say, yeah, we're okay with the $20,000 educationally, that things are being done above board. The difficulty you're going to have with your new 50, should you get them, is you don't have people certified to fund the classes that you're in. How are you going to get 50 additional teachers unless through the regulatory process, there's some mechanism for, and I'm not going to say non-certified people, but appropriately certified people to be at a PPT from Hartford, the 50, let's say. So I don't know, Madam Chair, how you at some point in time, what the role of MARB is, whether it's through testimony at the committee level, at the state. And I would ask Hartford's folks to come up with what they think an appropriate role for MARB is to support their initiatives. And then we could take that under advisement with the secretary and say, yes, we can, or because then you're into the political arena. And
correct.
I'm not going to speak for the secretary on that.
Neither am I, and I'm not going to attempt to. That question will go directly to the secretary.
So that's, but it is a very, very sticky wicket that's been around, as you know, for years and years and years.
Yep.
But it does need to be addressed incrementally. There's no doubt about it. It needs to be raised.
I see that Mr. White has his hand up.
Yeah, I mean the people that are dealing with this seem to say that the system is out of whack, but there's a gradual approach that needs to be used. I guess my question is there a timeline of incremental changes that you think are doable under that rubric? Because it sounds like, you've said this is what I think I can get today, and that's important to you. And I totally, that makes a lot of sense. But this is, the numbers, I forget the numbers, but what the superintendent said, they were pretty startling numbers. And the state is in relatively good financial position. And, I leave it to others as to when you make the move, but you need, I think, an agenda in your desk drawer that you pull out and say, now we're going forward. And you're going to get some headwinds without a doubt. But, if people are serious about open choice, and are serious about special ed, you got to deal with it. You can't sweep it under the rug.
No.
It's just not fair to the other students in the district.
Mr. White, I say all the time, if you don't ask, the answer is always no.
That's
correct.
That's right.
And I do like the approach of what you proposed here of some type of a roadmap that gets us from where we are today to what we think would be a better place. And I'll take that back to the special ed team here and the superintendent and say, what would this look like on one slide if we had to do it? If we had to map out the next few legislative sessions, what would this look like for us?
And the other thing was, I didn't quite understand what Mark was saying about a regulatory approach that didn't require the legislature. Is it Department of Ed? Who's the regulator, and what are the strategies for dealing with the regulator?
Mr. Waxenberg, I don't want to speak for you, but I think I got the gist of what you were saying. Is that in theory, State Department of Education could come up with I'll use the term price list. What's the standard cost per hour of the derivatives that go into an IEP and all the different services that are covered underneath there, and that would become the uniform state standard for, okay, this is what you're allowed to charge, and then you can add 10% to that for your overhead, just to throw out numbers, right?
Yep.
Because like I said, right now there really is no mechanism governing that.
I mean, that
like
seems to be a
insurance
small
company?
incremental step that couldn't that be done? I mean, I have no idea what the blowback would be, but it is a regulatory agency. It's a reasonable request.
I guess applying statewide standards to pricing has always been a problem, right? And we're
Yes.
even seeing that with the state plan for insurance when they first came out. What was the first towns that jumped on it? It was Fairfield County, because the costs in Fairfield County are a lot like New York City. So I would come back with the blowback's going to be, if your hourly rate actual is higher than what the state rate is going to be, you're not going to be happy. If your actual rate is below what the state's now going to say you're going to get, you'd be pretty good with that change. And my guess is you're going to look to a medium that's going to make everybody unhappy. So
I mean, either that or you peg it to a local standard, like you were saying, that if a certain kind of teacher in Fairfield is paid X, then it would be based on that X. And if that same teacher in Sprague is paid less, then it would be off of that. I mean, again, I don't know the mechanisms for it, but if the one size fits all is going to, create a firestorm, then maybe there's another way to do it. And, you know, hopefully you're not sending too many people to Fairfield County, but,
What you've described, Mr. Penn, reminds me of what my insurer engages in, which is this is what we're willing to reimburse, and you know, it's a different market, I understand, but there are
Right.
certainly analogs for you know, a model that you've just described.
Sure.
You know, the legislative body is notorious for creating committees, commissions with various people to examine things and come up with recommendations. You know, dealing with the immediate problems that you've identified is crucial, but going forward with through the education committee probably, or approach to set up a commission with, whether it's State Department of Ed, with certain people identified on it, like they do all the time, with a charge to come up with a standard. Now, when I say standard, I'm not sure the one size fits all is a good standard, but at least something where you walk out of, we know Greenwich teachers are going to be paid more than Bridgeport teachers. I don't have a problem. I just need to know it. I'm not going to ask Greenwich, you know, you pay your teachers 20, but state will only give you 10. I'm not saying that's the case. What I'm saying is right now it's an unknown. I don't know what Greenwich, or let's say West Hartford, is the IEP for Mark Waxberg. I have no idea what price tags are associated with his services. Somebody should be able to figure that out. If Christine Shaw is going to be the teacher for Mark Waxenberg, and it's 2 hours a week, you factor that into the IEP, as well as other quote unquote costs, and it's everybody says, yeah, it makes sense. It's shipped off to Hartford. This is what you could expect the cost to be. That's at least got some knowledge of expenses and services associated with Mark Waxenberg, that everybody's on the same page. How that's funded through education cost share is a separate issue, which I have always believed anything above normal cost should be fully funded by the state, but that'll never happen. So it is an evolutionary process, but I would suggest one of the easier ways of dealing with the legislature is to create another committee. And they're always, as Christine knows, they're always amenable to that as long as they don't have to spend money. But at least start for a good conversation to come back to whoever the committee of cognizance would be in this area. It's a start. That's all you can do. Right now, like you said, right now, nothing means nothing.
Mr. White, you have another question? I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Speak up.
He's got to come off mute first.
thank you, Mark.
And he can speak up all he wants, but if he's on mute, we still don't hear him.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I was just wondering see if I understand this, the issue of one size doesn't fit all is because teachers are paid differently in different areas. And are we talking about reimbursement to the teachers, to the district, or are we talking about the private
right?
facility, which is tagged to, I mean, from what you said, the practice has been the private facilities set their prices based on local teachers' salaries.
No. Let me clarify that, if I may.
Go ahead. Thank you.
So if you're a receiving district under choice, in theory, you're pegging the rates that we're being charged as a sending district to your underlying contracts, right? So in other words, if I have 10 hours a week with a special education teacher, I should be able to drill down into, okay, what's 10 hours of that teacher's time plus benefits plus overhead. So if that student has a one-on-one paraprofessional, there should be a linkage to whatever's in that paraprofessional contract in that receiving district. But the rates are all over the place, and we have 23 districts under choice right now. then I can almost guarantee you those are not the same rates if I was to look across all 23 of them. And so private facilities are entirely in a different bucket in some respects, right? Because again, they're just that. They really, I'm not even sure they have underlying contracts supporting what they do.
I see. So that this is a very basic question. So
Yeah.
under choice, Hartford has to pay the receiving town its
Their rate.
its cost when that receiving town provides the services.
That's
The
correct.
second bucket is receiving town sends open choice student to a
Yep.
private facility.
Yep.
And
we
the
pay,
state-
and Hartford
can't
pays those costs as well.
Right. The State Department of Ed can't regulate that charge to the private facility. Because isn't that where the cost is? I mean, the bulk of the cost is in these private facilities with transportation and all this.
I would tell you it's the higher cost on a per student basis, but not necessarily higher overall. And I'll use the example of
Right.
we've got 600-ish students identified as special ed in open choice. The 550 generate a fair amount of cost too,
Gotcha.
not just the 50.
Gotcha. Okay.
And we've probably presented that, and I just don't remember the breakdown in front at the moment. But I thought we'd embedded some of that analysis when we talked about this a few months ago.
I think you did. Yeah.
That you're right, on a per student basis, somebody going to a facility is going to be much higher for the transportation costs and things that are associated with it.
Yep.
But when you look at the total bucket of costs,
Right.
the 550 may actually be higher.
Sure. Okay. All right. I'm over 50. I forget these things. So.
Me too. I got you. Yeah.
Me too.
Great.
Finally, for me, looking at your numbers, roughly 20% of the students that you send to open choice districts are identified either in Hartford or at the district of being special ed, and approximately 8%, according to my calculations, are outplaced by the receiving district.
Yeah.
And I think you did this before, but that's a number that I think needs to be put forward to see if there's any, I don't want to call it abuse, but any significant departure from Hartford's numbers. In other words, I'm not sure Hartford's population is 20% special ed by identification. I want to say it's in the high teens, but not 20. It's outplacements. I'm not sure it's as high as 8%, but that's for you to do whatever. My concern is of the 23 receiving districts, 20% of a student body being identified as special ed, to me, depending upon the handicapping well, I don't want to say handicapping condition. The condition is high. And I just wonder if there's over-identification. Those are discussions down the road, but I think that dealing with percentages and saying, why are our placements 20% being special ed? Then drilling down, why are Simsbury students at 40%? You know, getting at being a receiving district and wanting a Cadillac and only housing Cadillacs and dealing with the Fords is another issue in my head. I just don't have the trust in receiving districts to not jettison costs, et cetera, associated with students that should not be identified, but are identified because it's easier. And if I'm not paying for it, I'll identify students all day just to get them out of the classroom or get them services that they may or may not need. So there has to be some, like you said, and I think we agree, some oversight. And right now there's limited, other than the goodwill of the PPTs, which I really have faith in. But then again, as you know, as a former board member and in person, there are abuses. You're not going to get them all, but at least right now it's an open door.
Well, thank you for that, discussion? Anything else that we want to add?
No, and I appreciate the level of time you've dedicated to this morning. This is an important issue for us and for our students. And at
Understand.
the end of the day, I mean, we want to make the decision that's best for the kid. But it's like, how do we operate within the system and make the system better in order to do that?
I agree. Thank you. Then let's move on to the next agenda item, which is the budget mitigation measures. Leanne. Thank you, Mr. Penn.
Sure. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
My presentation will be extremely shorter than Phil's, but this is definitely his month and he's got a lot of important issues to deal with. But as far as mitigation measures, we only really had changes in 2 of the categories. The first being tax collection efforts related to our license plate scanning initiative. So we had a contractor who went around for 5 years checking for compliance as far as personal property taxes and motor vehicle taxes as it relates to motor vehicles. And that resulted in additional tax billings that process through our tax software. And then we collect on those billings every month, like a regular tax bill. So for the month of October, we had an additional $7,500 in collections over what was reported for the month of September. So in total, to date so far, $82,000 has been collected for this initiative. And these collections will continue to happen until we get to the end of those billings from those 5 years that the vendor worked for us. We did not renew the contract with the vendor. Our goal with hiring that vendor was to just ensure compliance. And I think we've gotten a lot more than where we were 5-10 years ago. So we want to kind of let things fall out and then see how the residents react in the next few years and determine if we need to do this compliance check again. And then the second initiative that we had some success with in the month of October was through our grant opportunities. If you look at the spreadsheet that was provided by Julian, I'm just going to highlight 2 of the larger grants that we received in the month of October. One being the Burn grant through the Department of Justice, and this grant is for high-risk juveniles. And that grant was $1.3 million. Our goal for new grant opportunities was $3 million, and we've already exceeded it through October. So far, we're having a pretty successful year. The second grant that I wanted to highlight was through DECD, and I believe this is through their ARPA funds, and it's the Municipal Outdoor Recreation Grant for Keeney Park, and that was for $4.3 million. So pretty good month. Other than that, we don't have any real changes or nothing significant to even mention. We are focused mainly this month and next month. I don't anticipate a lot of changes on these mitigation efforts just because we're focused on getting through the audit.
Understand. How about staffing? Has that changed for you? Because I know that staffing was an issue as far as being able to focus in a lot of these areas.
We were able to hire 1 additional staff in the tax collector's office. We originally made 2 offers. Both were accepted. One showed up on the first day of work and the other declined the position the weekend before. So, and we've been experiencing that a lot where people will accept the position, they sign the offer letter, we take action to get them set up in the city system and get their workstation set up. And then right before first day, we get the rejection notice. So I'm hoping that that trend will end soon. We are definitely getting more qualified candidates through our HR department for positions. Not so much on the accounting positions, but on the other positions within the department, definitely.
Good. Not to shift gears, but I'm going to shift gears since Mr. Penn is still with us and he mentioned in the finance area, you're still struggling in that area too.
I am. I actually had two pretty significant losses to my team within the last 2 weeks here. One an accounts payable and purchasing person, and we lost one of our accountants as well. So we've gotten both. Well, one position's posted, the other one should be going up today. We're losing one position internally. It's a good move for her, so I'm obviously supportive. But the other one we're losing to the state. She's going to DSS because DSS offered more money and a hybrid work schedule. So
I understand.
yeah. But I will tell you, it is very difficult finding qualified candidates out there right now.
So how many are you down in the finance area?
Those two, plus I am down a grant writer right now, where I expect to actually start conducting interviews on that position probably the week after Thanksgiving.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm about to post a risk and benefits manager to cover retirement that's going to happen at the end of the year.
Okay.
So technically, I'm recruiting for 4 positions right now.
Okay. And you, Leanne, in the finance area?
Yep, we're recruiting for 10 in finance and 1 in budget.
Okay. Thank you. Let's move on to giving us an update on your fiscal year 22 audit, as we know that you are intimately involved with.
Definitely. So I mentioned in previous meetings that the audit isn't going as smooth as it has been in previous years, but we are pushing along. It's a little bit slower than it has been. As you know, we've lost a lot of institutional knowledge. My accounting supervisor of 20 years who did all of the accounting for CDBG grants and then ran basically the audit for finance department left last December. So we did get a new person in on CDBG, struggling a little bit to finalize that fund. That is the last fund that we now have to submit to the auditors. Other than that, we just this week finished up the general fund. We were waiting on the Board of Ed to finish up some of their grant accounting. So we finished up our general fund, our CIP funds, which are the 2 largest funds and more complex funds for the city. And now we're just sifting our way through the single audit accounting that we need to get over to the auditors by end of this week. So hopefully by end of business tomorrow, we should have the remaining outstanding items over to CLA.
Okay.
We may be a little behind with fixed assets, so that may have to go early next week.
Okay.
But that
Just
should
to-
be
just-
the last of information.
And just to
too.
piggyback on that, from our perspective, as Leanne said, we were trying to tick and tie out our last few pieces of our special funds to our general funds. We finished that up yesterday. We got compensated absences that we finished this week. We finished off, I just saw the journal entry go through a little while ago for a deferred revenue piece that we had a book. And I think the last piece that we're working on is going to be student activity funds, and we're targeting the end of the month to have that finished.
Good.
I would like to also mention that we were notified on Tuesday that we received the GFOA Certificate of Achievement in Financial Reporting for 2021. So
That's fabulous.
yeah, they
That's
were a
great
little
news.
late in getting the awards out
Congratulations.
this year, but we're happy to be a recipient.
Very good.
Thank you.
All right. So you think you'll still meet the target through the end of the year is what your goal is?
Well,
right.
I will say, Ms. Kennison, that CLA has not mentioned anything about an extension, so it still looks very doable. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, good luck.
And you know, they've asked us to be on a fairly accelerated timeline here, mostly because of their transition to being bought out
Understand.
and needing more time for partner review at a national level than they have in the past.
And we're experiencing that for other municipalities. Very good. Let's move on to any other questions? Any questions from the members or comments? No, okay. Last agenda item is other business, and I wanted to bring to the subcommittee members' attention that to take a look at the subcommittee, standard practices is that we meet for the city of Hartford every single month. And last year we chose to make a change with the town of Sprague as they get into a more routine efforts. And I wanted to pose to this committee, is it necessary for us to meet every single month? Could it move to a every other month situation, or focus, definitely with the focus of the budget side, the audit side? I know there is work that we still want to accomplish, but is it necessary for us to meet every single month? My recommendation would be no, but because we have some pretty light months as we go forward, and I feel as if Hartford is getting into that well-oiled machine situation. And that wouldn't, you know, have them, they would still report to the full MARB. And, but I wanted to hear your feedback from a subcommittee perspective. Unless there's a contract. If you have a contract, if we have a, standard business, then we can always have a special meeting should we need it. Yes, Christine.
Thank you for raising this. I'd agree that, the city of Hartford is on a very good path. As was acknowledged and has been acknowledged, they're making really good progress. Reporting is very responsive to the questions and ongoing challenges that the city has. I would favor continuing the frequency of reporting in terms of submitting on a monthly basis updates on the mitigation plans and the like, but moving to an in-person meeting schedule on the frequency that Ms. Kennison has recommended.
Perfect. And Mr. White?
I think that makes a lot of sense, that to do the in-person meeting. I too am impressed with the competence and the directness of the reports. But I think we can receive written reports on a monthly basis that we can review. We can, if there are serious questions, we can send them to you to follow up at the meeting. But folks, the folks on this call have a lot to do, and
Sure.
Leanne, you were here for an hour and a half on some very important stuff, and I'm sure you have nothing else to do. But so I think that is would be a good way to do it. And the contract, we got to think a little bit about how to handle those contracts on special meetings. I don't know, but I think that's right. If there is something with a timeline, then we can certainly accommodate that. So I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, and again, I don't mind if others don't mind. This contract was not a lot of complication to it, and it was very straightforward. I think that this committee could easily make that recommendation. It could go straight to the MARB, but our practices has always been to flush it through the subcommittee first and then bring it to the straight MARB. But I want to hear from the subcommittee as, are you looking for an every other month, or are you looking for a similar as we have with Sprague, where the budget season is a heavy topic, and we definitely want to have those meetings. Labor contract is another time that we would have to align with, as well as once the audit is completed, we want to hear from them on that audit. Or the other option is just going to an every other month. I'm wondering if it could be, even less than 6 times a year. Does it need to be, 4 or 5? Once we get to the important times, such as budget and audit and those call outs. Now, MARB is different. I don't know if you're want to make a different recommendation as far as the MARB is concerned. At this moment, I didn't seek to change them from the MARB perspective, just the subcommittee. The MARB, they would still have to come forward. That would have to be brought to the attention of the full MARB. And we're going to be voting on a calendar at the full MARB meeting. That's my reason right now to make the adjustments to the subcommittee and propose a new recommendation is my thoughts. Of not just myself and Julian too.
Well, I
Yeah.
think scheduling every other month meetings and is appropriate, but if there's any other intervening issues that need to be dealt with, either by the town or city, then we can meet accordingly outside of the schedule.
Okay.
But I have not wedded to every month. I would leave it up to the, like you said, I don't want to have a meeting for the sake of having a meeting.
I agree.
So I don't have scheduling every other month as an issue.
Right.
But just be mindful that there may be a need to schedule more frequently in certain times of the year or
Sure.
rest of the legislative session if we're going to be asked at some point in time to get involved in any issues. That Chief Penn, special ed or something, having a meeting specifically devoted to that I'm just speaking out loud.
I understand.
Scheduling every other month for practical purposes is fine with me.
Okay.
But being on call when necessary also is fine with me.
Great. And if the agenda is light, just the same, then we will send the materials and rather than bring everybody forward
Yeah,
as we have in the past. Yes, Mr.
Kim,
Ward.
I think that I would not be in favor of a Sprague type of schedule.
Okay.
Hartford is substantially different and more complicated. And
Understand.
we do have meetings like this where we delve into an issue. So
Sure.
I think I would keep the every other month with
Okay.
the, we can do stuff. The other thing, though, I think in terms of reducing time is to the extent that reports can be written. And, sometimes we go into a level of detail on hiring and audit progress that I think is important. I don't know that it really requires all the MARB committee members to hear that. I mean, if they report to OPM and, you send it out, I think that would be good, and they wouldn't have to, the city wouldn't have to sort of sit through some of that. Because I think we don't want to take unnecessary city time for this. They are doing a good job. Let's see that they do it. But Hartford is too complicated to go to a Sprague type of schedule.
Yeah, I wasn't. Yeah, I'm not proposing it. I was just using the stating of the reduction. Okay. Yep. All right. Thank you for your feedback. Any other items that anybody would like to bring to the members' attention?
Move to adjourn.
Thank you. Second, please.
Sure.
Thank you, Mark. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Have a good Thanksgiving, everyone.
Thank
too.
you. You too.
Bye-bye.
Please.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Take care.